Hello everybody, I'm back again, and yep, I'm here. For those of you just tuning in, I am spending this month just sort of trying to get back into the process of streaming and reading manuscripts. While I am not this one, but every other one I'll be marking up for editing so that I can publish them later on. These are all my dad's manuscripts. I inherited a whole bunch of them, and now I'm just working through them as we go. But you're tuning in. If you're just tuning in, you're tuning in a bit late. You might want to go back to past broadcasts in order to listen to the previous 4 chapters. So, or you can jump right in. Who am I to judge? So, without further ado, I'm going to jump right into chapter 5 of The Guardian of the Sword. Just so you're also aware, this is an alternate manuscript, in case you've heard of this book before. Alternate manuscript. It came out, it was written 5 years after the original one, which is published and out in stores right now. So, there we go. Alrighty. Chapter 5, Guardian of the Sword. For every new method, every new tactic which Rourke and Connell used, or trained the war host for, men will point to how this tactic was used in such and such a skirmish years before, or how that one was once recorded as having been employed against the barbarians of the wildlands. So it may be. But it was Rourke and Connell who first trained a host to use such tactics as a more normal means rather than an expedient one for one time. They had eventually a war host capable of swift and efficient maneuver on a field of battle, allowing a commander to take advantage of any momentary opportunity which he might see, rather than relying on a single formation, plus whatever reserves might be available. The amount of training necessary to reach this standard, of course, had to be balanced with other factors, such as how long the Hygerians would leave them alone in the hills. The Hygerian War by Randall Vaventier. Rourke, you are my good friend and trusted adviser, but I say that we dare not spend more time skulking in these hills like this. You hear the same things I hear. You hear that there are already doubts that we plan to do more than fortify ourselves in the hills at the expense of the lowlands. We must move. Connell, we are the last army of Asbeln. If we go out too soon and fall, then there may not be another way, finished Connell. We have had that discussion before, but the folk of my dead father's realm risk their lives to send us food and supplies while we sit safe here in the hills, save for times when we ride out for a day or so and ask for more food and supplies. I wish us to act like an army, not a band of brigands. Orin nodded, fingering his amber beads. Our men are still young, craving attention. If there is none, soon we shall see them quarreling among themselves and going back to their homes, or going out raiding by themselves because we will not lead them. Rourke looked at Baron, who looked back and then away, as though he did not like what he must say, then back at the Guardian. I fear, Guardian, that the Prince and Chief Orin are right. You have collected many young men young enough to laugh at death, but men who are too young to care for caution. While we train and drill them, and make them match for twice their number of Hygerians, we risk losing them because we are too cautious and show no sign of going out to fight the foe. And that is why they came to us, to fight. Rourke sat silent, his forehead furrowed in concentration. Finally he looked up at his companions. Yes, you are right. We must not keep these young men too long in training. Yet I fear the results of offering battle too soon. There are risks to both courses, so if we go out in a way that makes it clear that we are no mere bandits, yet arrange matters so there is little chance of defeat, that might do as well." "You have a plan in mind?" Connell leaned forward, his eyes alight. One evening, lots were cast among the young hillmen, and the next morning, Rorik and Connell led the 80 winners out against the fortress of Verdun. Rorik, who still had some misgivings, still managed to maintain a cheery mood, and even he had to admit it was necessary to deal with Verdun in order to delay the Hygerian march into the hills. They had had a constant word about the state of the fort's completion. They had had a constant word about the state of the fort's completion. The latest report was that the original stockade was now being expanded, but was not yet fully completed. When the two leaders crouched on the hill overlooking the fort, they saw that the palisade was up, except for one small gap, which was blocked by wagons. They paused only shortly to complete the plans for the attack. Then they moved back. When the sun was finally down, the horsemen mounted. The prince turned to Rorik. "Who will ride with me this night? Who is with me in this fight? Bitter and deep are Asbeln's woes. Who will ride against her foes?" Rorik replied, "Bitter indeed are the Asbeln's woes. Fierce and numerous are her foes. Behold, my prince, and with thee we ride, as close as a shield upon thy side." They smiled at each other then, and the prince gave the signal, and the horsemen began to move through the night. A small group rode down opposite the gap in the palisades, carrying small closed jars suspended on cords. Approaching the gap, they reined in their horses, swung the jars in great circles around their heads, and cast them inside. At the first approach of the horsemen, the Hygerians had begun to sound the alarm. But while the first jars were shattering, splashing oil across the buildings and piles of stores, another man outside had broken a jar on the ground, spilling some hot coals, onto which another man had tossed a handful of dry grass, a bundle of twigs. It flamed almost immediately, and now the horsemen were leaning out of their saddles to extend arrows tipped with balls of pitch into the flames. As the first of the burning arrows flew into the fort, some of the horsemen began to fire steadily and accurately at any Hygerian who showed himself. The Hygerians, not used to living in towns, and with only little experience of fortifications, had made no preparations against fire. There was confusion within. Some sought to fight the attackers, some tried to fight the fires, some tried to do both, and some did neither. A group of horsemen rode in to cast loops of rope over the wagons, blocking the gaps, and while their comrades' arrows prevented the Hygerians from hindering them, pulled several wagons out of their places. One tall Hygerian managed to form a group of men to hold the gaps against the horsemen, but the arrows proved too much for them, and when the horsemen finally began their rampage through the fort, the Hygerians fought only for a brief time, then were struggling to escape. For all the efforts of the horsemen, a number of them succeeded. Even before the last of the Hygerians had fled or died, some of the horsemen were doing what they could to salvage anything usable from the fires. They managed to preserve much, but much else was lost. Rorik, rubbing a spot on his cheek where a hot ember had landed, looked at Connell. "Well, we have done it." "Aye, but it would have gone ill with us if we had had more archers." Aye, but it would have gone ill with us if they had had more archers. We appear to have lost only 6 men, mostly to the javelins. Once we got to close quarters, they were no longer fighting. We do well for a band of brigands, do we? Sorry. We do well for a band of brigands, do we not? The prince grinned, looking a trifle embarrassed. I said harsh things to you, did I not? Forgive me, Rourke. It is the curse of kings and princes to have a double measure of pride, and I can think as well. How often, for instance, will we be fighting our enemies at night, with them silhouetted against the fire for our arrows? Probably never again. That is why each battle must be as carefully planned as this one. Most true. Well, our brigands seem to have saved everything they could. Let us go to the town. Hopefully the folk of Verdun will be able to supply bandages and salves. Also, a little food and drink would be in order. In the market square of Verdun, they put up a proclamation to inform the people that the king was in the hills with his host, and that he had been joined by the wielder of the sword. It also bid every willing man to come and join them in the struggle. It was signed in Connell's name, and sealed with the Red Dragon of Asbeln. The local innkeeper was unwilling to open his door at such an hour, but when several loud voices offered to remove the door from its hinges, he complied. They ate much of his stored food, and drank much of his ale, but they paid well for it, in fine Hygerian coin and jewelry. They sent the innkeeper to find bandaging material, leaving his somewhat flustered wife to see over to other sorts of provisions. Though some of the younger members of the company jested with the couple over their unfriendly reception for the king of Asbeln and his army, the tone of things between the army and the villagers gathered in curiosity outside the door was generally friendly. Indeed, many of the horsemen were well known in the town, Verdun being a trading center for skins and hides brought out of the hills. Then, too, a couple of old veterans, who had made their way from the red ruin of Drick's Field, swore that this was indeed the prince. And, at last, Rourke, calling their attention to the smoking ruins of the Hygerian fortress, drew the sword. The glow from that blade, well known from the legends of Arvindal, banished all doubt from any mind. They gave a cheer for the king, another for the guardian, and one more for their oh my gosh. This is the problem with trying to read live. Icarian allies. The horsemen mounted and rode away in a long double column. As they disappeared over the rise, the townspeople turned to each other, looking again and again at the ruined fortress, for proof that their eyes had not deceived them, that they had seen what they had thought they had seen. A week later, Rourke and a band of 20 horsemen were out on a long patrol with the intent of discovering any news about the Hygerians and their intentions. The young hillmen, who had been scouting their forward trail, came back at a gallop to report a force of Hygerians, 50 spearmen and 50 archers, marching along the trail toward them. Rourke took his men off the trail and watched from the brow of the hill as the Hygerians marched below. To charge at them would give them time to take a formation with the spearmen in front and the archers shooting over their heads. Rourke could look to lose most of his force in such a case. Yet it irked him to allow them to pass unmolested, to have to ride to the hills for help. A plan began to come to him. He gave quick instructions to his men, and waited as they took up their positions. Then, at the head of about half of them, he rode over the hill to come down on a double column of infantry at a dead run. The enemy reacted with speed, spearmen moving to form a double line, bristling with spear points, while the archers took up a similar weighting the proper range. At extreme range, Rourke and his group halted and began loosing arrows. Shooting downhill was difficult enough, and at that range there were few hits, save a few that glanced off an armor or a shield. After some hesitation, the Hygerians began moving forward, still in their formation, trying to close the range. As they did so, the remainder of the horsemen came galloping round the hill. They swept down behind the Hygerian line, loosing arrows at very close range. The enemy tried to answer them, but Rourke's group was moving again, and while some stood still, others turned. Confusion was in command, and when the formation was truly mixed, the horsemen charged home. The Hygerians broke and fled. About 15 archers and an equal number of spearmen formed into a circle and withdrew sadly and determinedly toward a small grove of trees, refusing to allow themselves to be panicked into breaking formation, loosing arrows when the horsemen came too close. The horsemen concentrated on those less steady in temperament. About 60 escaped in all, including the small, determined band, who made their way along among the trees, where it was nearly impossible for the horsemen to approach them. Rourke and his troop contented themselves with gathering all the Hygerian equipment they could carry, particularly the armor. They had lost 4 men, but the gain in equipment and morale made it a good trade. Okay. For 3 weeks, they had small bands out raiding against the Hygerian outposts and garrisons and attacking patrols. Sometimes they defeated the Hygerians. Occasionally they were beaten off, but they continued to learn their trade. As they extended their activities, it became more and more difficult to keep their entire force mounted. They had taken as many horses as they could from the nearest lowland areas, while the Hygerians had been even more insistent on replacing their own lost mounts from local steadings. The situation was such that the horsemen took to attacking almost any party of Hygerian cavalry in the hope of acquiring 1 or 2 horses. They had even sent messengers out to the Harvatai, who dwelt in the wildlands, who were known to raise very fine horses. In the meantime, men from the lowlands were making their way into the hills to seek out Prince Conall and offer their services. At Carol Dawn, the army of Asbeln came into being and grew. Okay, so once again, that is all for this evening. So normally what I'll do is I will definitely try and do some, like chit-chatting afterwards. It's always hard for me to try and do chatting while the stream is taking place because, yeah. Because obviously I'm reading, so it's hard for me to like look up and look down. So I will, when I'm doing other manuscripts, when I come to a break, if you see me drinking the coffee, I'm going to be checking the chat rooms quickly to see if anybody wants to say anything, that sort of thing. But it's a one-person show right now, so it's hard for me to try and do lots of this, that, and the other. But yeah. I thank you all for tuning in, and I will be back again with some more chapters. Yeah. Have a good night.